Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hiraeth and Other Words podcast. I am your host, Timothy Mangle, and this week we are talking about Migrating the Field. This is a little bit of a continuation off of last week's episode, the episode titled The Field in Which All Things Grow. And in that episode, I discussed this belief called panentheism, or rather, as it is in Greek, meaning all in God. Meaning, the image that I really try to paint is this one of God being a field in which all things grow out of it. I talked about this idea that Paul Tillich presented to the church, that is, God is the ground of all being, and everything that has being, or all isness, or anything that can be named, or just anything, all has its groundings and its roots going deep into this thing called God, and God grows up all those things, and he grows through all those things. So that's kind of what we talked about last week. I just summed it up real quick, so you don't have to go back, but if you want to go back, it's there for you to listen to. And I just wanted to say that I got a lot of really good feedback from that episode, just people messaging me and just, being encouraged, or, they had never really seen God painted that way before, so I don't mean to toot my own horn, but apparently it was a decent episode. So if you want to go back and check that out, if you've already watched it, maybe share it with a friend, whatever. I'm just happy that you're here. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about migrating the field. So let's kind of break that down. What does it mean to migrate? Well, it essentially just means to move from one place to the next, right? From being able to start here and to go through whatever and to end up at another place. That's what migrating is. And the field is essentially the idea of God that I laid out in the last episode, right? So, if God is, or let's say rather that if the universe is something that it's growing out of God, if it's extending out of God, and we are a part of that, then as we move through reality, as we try to get from point A to point B, what we're really moving through is this large field of, the ground of being, of godness, of divinity, or whatever, that's saturated and soaking deep into all of creation. And again, and manifests itself as the reality that we experience. So I just said a lot of things to say we need ways to help us move through life. I think a lot of people don't like the word religion for a lot of reasons. And a lot of those reasons are justifiable and understandable. But as I've talked about before on this podcast, the word religion itself is actually a very beautiful word. The word comes from, I believe it would have to be either Latin or Greek. Greek. I can't remember at the moment, but it's religios, which sounds more Latin. Anyways, the history of the word religion begins with this word religios, which means to relimb. Right? So think about it this way. You have something, a tree branch is broken off from a tree. You need to relimb it, or, whatever it is. It's this idea of connection back to the original thing that we were a part of, right? So, if my arm fell off, it wouldn't be like, oh, I'm my own thing. I'm, autonomous by myself, or even that thing grew out of me. It understands that it is a part of the larger phenomenon of Timmy. And I think, that's sort of the place that we play in relationship to God, is we're this extension of, and for whatever reason, we find ourselves feeling disconnected. And I know not everyone's going to be using the language of God or feeling disconnected from God in their everyday life, but I mean, it's the same thing as saying, you're feeling off center, or you're not feeling like yourself, or you're just, I believe everyone knows what it feels like to be in harmony, or to be in sync, or just to be, riding the peaks of the mountain, or whatever that is. So we all know what those harmonious moments feel like, but I feel like for most people that they don't live there necessarily. I think, and those times can be and are often called religious experiences, or religious phenomenons, or whatever. There's this when we have connection, when we feel aligned, when we feel like ourselves, when we feel like everything's flowing naturally and perfectly, or whatever, we're in this place of harmony. And I feel like most people don't live their lives there, and they kind of usually just save them for these special moments. People will think like, I'm going to a concert, and that's when I'll have this great experience or something like that, or I'm going to go see some friends this weekend, and I'm going to have this great experience, or whatever. But as I talked about last week, God again being this big term for the source of all being, the depth and the goodness of all things, that experience, and that the state from which the flow state arises out of, it's not separate from us. It's something that we live in and move in, and we have our being in. So I'm saying all this to say that there are ways that we can implement into our lives that make the flow state, or the phenomenon of being connected, or at one, or at harmony, or peace, whatever, these don't have to be saved for other times. And the problem is that we don't see the sacredness, or the beauty of the things that are all around us, right? And again, so you can just look back at the examples that I have, all of these examples of times that we feel the most aligned, or awakened, or, whatever it is, connected, whenever we feel most, peak of the valley, those are usually experiences that we, put off. It's like, I'm going to the show, I'm going to vacation, at the end of the week, I get the weekend, that's great. And those are all lovely things, but they're all things that are kind of, they're not now. And the problem with being here now is that we're here, and most people, it's hard for people to live with this expectation of, I'll just get through now, and I'll suffer long enough so that at some other point I can feel, relief and peace and all of those things. And I don't necessarily think that that's the intention of the Creator. Again, maybe it's above my pay grade to believe that I speak for it, or believe that I could even say what it has in mind, or whatever. But I feel like the readiness of life to give us things that are sustainable and enjoyable, and things that we can rejoice in, that life is ready to give us those things if we learn to see it, if we learn to see where it is and how to embody it. Last week when I ended the episode, I brought up this Bible verse, and I didn't read it, I just quoted it from memory, which is what I'm going to do now. But it's Jesus talking about being the vine, and us being the fruit of the vine, or the grapes of the vine, whatever language you want to use. And from the chapter in the Bible that comes from, Jesus continually talks about this idea of abiding in Him. And He says that you abide in Him by keeping His teachings. So right there, we kind of have this peek into what the whole purpose of religion and, all of these metaphors and stories and all these things that we have, because they're things that when we embody them, when we contemplate them, when we soak our lives in them, that they ultimately bring us back to this place of feeling connected. And I do want to say that, I think in my experiences with, a very strong and traditional or fundamental Christianity, they would say, you just have to always be feeling the presence of God. It means that you're doing something right and whatever. And I don't want that to be saying I don't want that to sound like what I'm saying here. Because, for anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge believer of you have to learn to see God in the suffering as well. That it's not just in these, the good times, the peak times, the religious experiences that I was talking about earlier, because again, we don't always live at those places. We kind of live in the in-between those places. And so, I feel like I might be repeating myself, but again, the point and the point of a lot of these religious practices or spiritual, whatever they are, it's to help us in the mundanity of life feel that presence. There's this Franciscan friar that I've mentioned on the podcast before named Richard Rohr, and he really loves talking about the idea of seeing God in the ordinary, in the plain, because I think our mind has been too tricked into seeing God as just these peak experiences, these really good experiences or whatever. But the reality is that, and I live a fairly comfortable life, but I can sit here and I can look around and there's a thousand reasons in this room alone for me to rejoice and for me to feel, I don't know, special or unique, and yeah, I think that learning to embody that is a huge percentage or a huge reason for why all of these religions and myths and metaphors exist. All right, so let's kind of go back. Let's go back to the early days of man. I want you to put yourself in their position. So I want you to think that you're an early hunter-gatherer. You just migrate, you follow the animals, you set up shop wherever they're going and whatever. And one of the oldest, recreations that we have is storytelling. It's one of the, it's the deepest and most ancient form of communal intimacy or something like that, of coming together as a group, is sitting and sharing stories with each other. I mean, think about when you go out to eat with your friends. I mean, how much of that time is spent just telling each other's stories, and everyone loves a good storyteller, and everyone loves experiencing a good story. That's the whole reason that people go to movies, listen to songs, read comic books. All of these things is because as early as we were able to communicate with each other, what we were doing was telling each other stories. Now, I want you to think, these same people are the reality that they're experiencing has to be so, I mean, maybe it's different, and I'm definitely looking back on with modern eyes, but has to be such a novel experience of, your trial and error is crazy, because you're trying to eat this plant and it's not working. You're trying to use that, it's not working. It's just so much trial and error. And as these societies progressed and they began to spread, what we begin to see is these stories being continually told. The story of Genesis is hundreds of years old prior to it being written down. So, then that story, the written version of it, is currently thousands of years old. Think about that. So that the book of, or at least the beginning chapters of Genesis, existed for hundreds of years before they were written down, and now the written version we have for thousands of years. So, the story of Genesis, whatever it is, generations upon generations believed that story and, a lot of other ones like it were so important that they needed to memorize these, literal chapters of books, but they also believed it to be their history. And it's not just their history, but it's deeper than that. These stories they're verbal attempts to try to articulate wisdom. And boy, howdy, is wisdom a hard thing to try to articulate. And there's a strong overlap. I mean, they're almost one and the same, and arguably they are. Is the embodiment of wisdom is that mode of being that I talked about earlier that helps you abide in the vine, to help abide in God. It's, everyone wants to be wise. Everyone wants to be able to go through life and, have it not kind of crumble down upon them. And that's why these ancient peoples were sharing these stories with each other and continually telling them and continually, thinking about them and all of those things. And, it's not just, I'm not just talking about Genesis here or Christianity or whatever, but I'm talking about us as a species. Is we're storytelling animals. We can't live without stories. And the crazy things about stories is that they have the tendency to be realer than real life. Because part of that is that it strips away a lot of the mundanity of life. And again, I talked about earlier about that's where, God is obviously in those places. But when it comes to hearing stories, for some reason, it just seems better when you're not talking about how many times you're blinking, or like when you're just sitting and there's nothing happening or whatever. But a good story kind of gets rid of all of the excess junk and kind of just gives you the heart of it. And man, the fact that I guess what I'm picturing in my head is, and how this relates back to the topic and all of those things, you have God coming out as this I'm gonna start over. You have God coming out as this experience of reality, and the experience goes out far enough that the experience itself begins to have experienced the phenomenon of disconnection back to that initial source. And that's where we find ourselves. And as these people are moving through reality, they're moving through the field, they're moving through, God, as they're trying to get from point A to point B and to survive it all. And as they're doing this, they're experiencing things, and they're trying to tell their children how to, hand these things off so that their generation can go a little bit farther than theirs did, because they didn't have the things that were holding them back. This is every person I've ever met who's been a parent wants their children to have a better life than them, and they should. And now think about if that's been true since the dawn of our species, and the progression that we've been able to go. And that's why, again, all of these stories and these tales, they're hundreds and thousands of years old, but we keep them with us because we don't know what we lose if we lose them. Now, I will say that America is, here's the reality of it, friends, is that this current generation of America is, one of the first generations in history to not have a connection back to, again, reality, meaning God, the source of all things. And again, I know the word God is so complicated, and people kind of think that the Christians own that word, but it's a phenomenon that is larger than any religion can kind of sum up or whatever. They're all extensions of the field. They're not the field itself. So I don't know. It's, there's a weird thing here, and I don't want to go into this too far, but our generation is the first one to not have a relationship with, whatever you would want to call it, God or source, or the supreme being, or whatever it is. And we also don't have a relationship with the stars, or the cosmos that sits above our head. We don't have a relationship with it, meaning we don't understand it. We're somewhat curious about it. We're flirting with it, but we're not really we don't want to marry it. Some people do, but I would say as a species. So there's this disconnect from both the thing that gives us life and the thing that sends us out, and also a disconnect between nature, really, or just our place in the cosmos. And as I get older, I fear that I turn into one of those people that are like, what's wrong with this nation? It's that they don't have a relationship with God. If everyone was a Christian, then this whole nation would be fine. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. But what I do believe is that people need good ways to connect back to who they truly are. And who you truly are at your core is divine, and you're a child of God, and you have divinity coursing through your blood. And we don't know anything about it, and we've forgotten that, and we've been wandering around in the muck of this school or this reality for so long that we've forgotten our place. And that's the purpose of these religious stories. Now, I feel like I've really nailed that home. So let's kind of, what's the benefits of having a spiritual practice or a religious worldview? And when I say religious worldview, what I mean by that is having a worldview that understands that we are connected, and there's an importance on the individual to learn how to be connected back to all of those things. And again, the reason that I bring up stories is because it's so important to us in how we can understand reality. As much as I, him and haw against Christianity, I'm fortunate enough to have been handed a worldview that gave me language for a lot of experiences that I would have, a lot of, it just gave me a decent worldview. And I think, for people who don't have religious or spiritual language around them, I won't say that it's that they can't. I won't say that those people can't truly connect back to reality. But again, the importance of these stories are the things that are so important, the things that really matters. What is the wisdom that is trying to be articulated within them for us to embody? One of my favorite books that I've ever I feel like I say that about every book, but this book that I really enjoyed reading is this book that I can see behind the camera is and the microphone, and it's called Wise Men and Their Tales. And it's a discussion about just random stories from the book of Genesis, which I keep bringing up. And in the book, there's a lot of, you have a lot of figures like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you see them doing things, and you see them interacting with God and their fellow man, and Abraham changes God's mind at least once in the Bible, if not more. So this book, Wise Men and Their Tales, is this discussion about these stories, and it's great because the perspective that they come from isn't one of saying who is right or wrong in the narrative. They just give every perspective possible. And the way that they do it in the book is this beautiful overlap where it blends very seamlessly between the characters within a story. And really, it really highlights the beauty of how Jewish people approach their text. I think in Christianity, we had this sort of sense of like there is one true interpretation of this, and once you have to find that and then stay by that. But I think for the Jewish people, what was, I'm actually remembering this proverb or this story that actually helps articulate this point, and it is a story about Jewish individuals. So there was a couple of rabbis or devout religious Jews sitting together and having a discussion, and there was a young man amongst them, and he was he knows his place, so he's sitting there quietly listening to the older men discuss these religious stories and the tales in the Torah and their Bible and these holy books, and they're going back and forth, and they're he's saying this thing and he's saying no, and then that guy's saying this thing, and then the young guy, after a while has passed, he stands up and he says, listen, he's like, this is what you're saying, this is what you're saying, this is the truth behind all of those things, and this is how you're misinterpreting each other or whatever. And the older gentlemen, they turn to this younger man and they're like, yeah, we know that, but that's not the point. The point is that we're having the conversation. And I always thought that story was very interesting because, again, it's not something that we necessarily think of, especially in our culture, because we're so gosh darn preoccupied with being right. But we're not preoccupied with having discussions about what is right. Because I think it's a lot more enjoyable for us, for whatever reason, to be like, this is what this is who I am, this is what I believe, you have to change my mind. And instead of having this, openness and this understanding of, well, maybe I'm not right about everything, and it's better to have a discussion than to assume that I know best. And I feel like I'm just going all over the place, but again, I think we're missing something in our culture because we don't take the time to sit and discuss. Again, it doesn't have to be biblical stories or whatever, but, this is a huge reason why movies are so popular right now. The Marvel movies I'm a huge fan of, but a huge reason that they're important to people is because they're giving stories for the individuals to discuss with their friends and to figure out, well, what is the true embodiment of righteousness, of wisdom? And so, I hope through this episode that you can see that I'm trying to paint this picture of God expanding out and us walking around within that and learning and realizing that we need to learn how to connect back to that. And that's how we share stories of trying to articulate wisdom, And as we embody those things, we feel that connection that we're always a part of, but for whatever reason, we're having this experience of disconnect. And again, that's what Jesus says when he says, abide in me, just abide in me by abiding in my teachings. If you're doing your teachings, you're going to manifest this thing called the kingdom of God, and you will live within that. And that itself is really the field being exposed as the most beautiful form of itself. Religious practices, they're more than just a large religion that, when I think about religions or spiritual practices or spiritual worldviews or philosophies or whatever, I like to think of a river, picture it with me. Picture a river flowing through all things and just, going down. And we have this innate desire to go into the river, and to go into the river we need these I always just picture bridges going into the water. So however that would be, however you want to imagine that, or we're just walking into the water, we well, it's not like we can just walk into the water, but usually what helps us is having some sort of path laid out before us that helps us get into the water. And what I mean by that is having spiritual practices. And again, it's not just having religions, but it's actually doing things in your everyday life, like meditating, chanting mantras, contemplating biblical verses or other books of wisdom, relaxing, self-love and self-care. These are all spiritual practices. The importance is to learn to put them into a routine. Now, we're kind of going full circle here. What is the word that people use when they talk about something that they do all the time and they use it to kind of help themselves feel normal? They say they do something religiously. People will say, I drink coffee religiously, or I listen to this guy religiously, or I whatever it is. It's this idea of, again, like, look, the fact that the word is just sneaking through the brain, and knowing that is the best word, that when we have these routines and these practices that help center us, these are religious practices, even if it is just getting a cup of coffee in the morning. And I think it's incredibly important to understand that that's what you're doing, that you're not just, because it's so easy to have those same things just fall into routine. But to understand that, when I'm getting my cup of coffee in the morning, when I'm saying my mantras, when I'm saying my prayers, whatever it is, it's not just out of a sense of duty. It's because I want to feel connected back to all things. And again, this offer, this potential invite into glory, into goodness, into those peak religious experiences. They're not just saved for, rock and roll concerts or the county fair or whatever it is. They're for moments just like this. They're for moments where you're sitting at the laundromat, when you're sitting at the post office, or the DMV, worst of all. It's God wants to be just as present in those moments as he does in anything else. And, I think these ideas of meditating and awareness and mantras and prayer, they're all things that we can do in the current moment. And, they don't have to be things that we push off. And these religious stories and tales and myths and metaphors show, brilliant examples and terrible examples of how people have tried to embody those principles and to have that reconnect. I mentioned this book earlier, Wise Men and Their Tales, and part of the reason I love that is because the book doesn't just say who's, it's not, it doesn't have a bias, because in the book it even questions, is God wrong in this moment? Is Abraham wrong? Is Lot right? Is Lot's wife right? Like, whatever it is, like, again, it's about the discussions about these things. And I think for a long time, and it's very common now, that people just read the stories of the Bible and they just say, oh, like, that's how a good person lives, or that's, whatever. But again, it's this need for discussion and this need for, to figure out how, what is best in your everyday life, So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I was just all over the place with this episode, which I do a lot of times. But what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that you are migrating through a field, meaning you are moving through reality. And we need ways that we can move through it more smoothly. And I think for a very long time, since the dawn of speech, since the dawn of stories, we've been trying to relay to each other how best to do that. How do we do that in the most proper ways? And through people's trials and errors and learning these, beautiful practices of mindfulness and meditation and prayer and all of these great, and it's more than that, because I'd hate for everyone to think that it means to be spiritual when you're just doing something that, again, is quote unquote spiritual. But you're being the most awake and most in that source, or connected back to that, when you're embodying love, when you're being compassionate, when you're sharing mercy with people. Those are just as beautiful spiritual practices as prayer and meditating and all of those things. And I'll end with this. I kind of said this earlier, but I'll say it now. If you're a Patreon supporter, you'll know this, because something that I talk about on the Patreon episodes a lot more than I do on these episodes is, behind the scenes and off camera, I've had a very stressful year, and obviously a lot of people have, and everyone's stressed, and I personally haven't been keeping up my spiritual practices as well as I should be. I don't meditate as much as I should be. I don't pray as much as I should be. I'm just not doing it as much as I used to. And consequently, I feel that disconnect. And I heard the spiritual teacher say one day, it's like, listen, if you don't want to meditate, then don't meditate. You're only going to grow bitterness and resentfulness for whatever it's because it's out of a duty, and it's not out of love. It's out of obligation. And I don't know. I want to encourage people. I just talked this whole episode about the importance of trying to embody wisdom and praying and meditating and all that stuff. But I also want to say, sometimes you just don't feel like doing those things. Sometimes you're just at a place where you're just done with everything, and you just given up and whatever. But I want to encourage you and say that is still part of the field in which all things grow. It's not just about these peak moments when we're feeling the best, and maybe I'm sending a weird message by saying that we should always try to be seeking that, and that's true. But I remember when I was moving out to Oregon, I was staying. I had just left Iowa, and I had stayed at a friend's house there, and I was going to somebody that I worked with in Taiwan's in-laws house to crash for the evening. And when I was driving through Nebraska, and I hit this huge just storm, and it just stopped everything, and I was delayed for a couple of hours. So I ended up getting at this house super late at night, and I was just burnt out, and I was exhausted, and just wanted to go to bed. And the bedroom that they took me in to sleep in had this little, little fun plaque on the wall that was hand sewn, and it had this verse on it from the Bible, and it said, "From one glory to the next." And that's a verse from Paul, who I talk about all the time. He says, from one glory to another, that we're moving from one glory to the next. And, I think about everything that I just talked about, these ancient people struggling through life, figuring out all the hard stuff to be able to pass on to the next generation, so that they can, go and figure out the even harder stuff and hand off that information back. And that is one glory to another. And so wherever you're at right now, if you feel like you're in a valley, if you feel like you're in a peak, just understand that it is one glory in the midst of many, many glories that you are being moved through. That creation and whatever it's doing, God and whatever it's doing is pulling us onto Him and onto her and deeper into this intimacy and this connection that we have, that we've forgotten. So my encouragement is wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, whatever you're practicing, you are in one glory, and you will move to the next. It's all a part of the field, and we relate back to the field through embodying love, because that's what's at the root of the field. All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. if I said anything, I'm trying to say our species for a long time has been trying to figure out how to best move through reality, and it's probably good for us to try to figure out what they were trying to say. And they gave us a lot of good stuff. Again, that's the Bible, it's the Bhagavad Gita, it's the Tao Te Ching, it's, the Buddhist teachings, it's love, it's wisdom, it's all of these things. It's the means by which we can connect back to source is so infinite because source wants us connected to it. Anyways, friends, my encouragement would be however you feel connected, do that to feel connected. If you don't want to do anything, then don't do anything. And if you haven't prayed before, if you've never meditated, I would encourage you to try those things and just see what happens. And lastly, I ask that you would love your neighbor as yourself and that you would love yourself. All right, friends, that's it for this episode. That's usually what I close things on, but like this thing on the internet, share it about. Anyways, sign up for the Patreon if you want to know there, or want to get the stuff there. All right, I'm done. Have a good one, friends. Thanks for hanging out.